Welcome, my fellow scholars, to Conquest Chronicles, the place where I, a stranger with no academic background, spout off about things that happened a very long time ago, to you, the ever-ravenous horde of YouTube. The subject of this video? Why, it's William the Conqueror's Norman invasion of England. Now you might ask why I would give time to such a topic. And there is a good reason for that. But I'm not going to tell you, so please, shut up, stop asking questions, and listen. Now, before we can talk about the Norman invasion, we need a little background. A little background lore to set the scene. Because if I just skip to William, you're going to have lots of questions for me, like, who is William? What's a Norman? Or, what is my dad's social security number? I'm going to answer 2 out of 3 of those questions shortly. While the events of our story don't really pick up until the year 1066, we are going to go back in time to the year 476. This is arguably the worst time in history to be a European. Now you may wonder, why on earth would I make such a bold claim? And there are quite frankly 2 reasons for that. First and foremost, there were no Waffle Houses in Europe back then. Second, the Western Roman Empire would collapse in this year. Why did the empire collapse, you may ask? Well, the causes of Rome's collapse have been the point of discussion between old white men wearing glasses for many years. I don't want to wade into that, not really. So instead, I'm going to give you my own 2 best guesses. First, Rome lacked waffles, and because of that, everyone became depressed and just stopped trying. Second, it was the Germans. While peaceful chocolate makers throughout most of history, they have on occasion fallen under the influence of men with facial hair. They just can't help it, it's in their blood. Now that one mustache man did not yet exist, but other mustache men did. And these mustache men led a bunch of Germans on what I will call extended foreign vacations. And in the 5th century, a bunch of these Germans crossed into Rome, did a little trolling, and then, in 476, they killed the Roman Empire. Now some of these tourists, they settled down, started farming, and formed a bunch of petty barbarian kingdoms. Now, eventually, these petty kings turned on each other and went to war. And the kingdoms consolidated, and soon you had a bunch of very powerful kingdoms. This happened throughout Western Europe, including the former Roman province of Britannia. You see, some Germanic invaders got lost and accidentally ended up in England. We know this was an accident because no rational human being would ever willingly set foot there. These lost migrants, also known as the Anglo-Saxons, would start as many small kingdoms, but by the early 900s had consolidated into but one mighty kingdom, the Kingdom of Wessex, and they ruled over the entirety of England. Or well, almost all of it. Because you see, on the eastern coast, there are a bunch of Viking settlements. Yes, only refugees from the land of PewDiePie would be desperate enough to migrate to the one place on Earth where God forgot to turn off the rain. Now these Vikings in England will prove important to the plot later, but for now, we turn our gaze southwards, across the English Channel, and into France. Or West Francia as it was known in those days. West Francia was ruled by a dude named Charles III. No idea why his mom named him that, but anyway, he was king, and besides having a very weird name, life was pretty good for old Charlie 3 Eyes. He was king, he got to sit in a fancy chair, and wear a hunk of yellow meadow upon his brow. You could say that everything was going... Wait a minute, what's that? It's a bunch of hairy foreigners with axes, and they're coming to kill us all. I'm of course referring to the Vikings. No, not the ones in England, these ones still had gray matter. These ones, instead of sailing to the Isle of Depression, instead sailed to West Francia. Why did they leave their homes in the first place? Because why on earth would anyone live in the frozen wasteland of Scandinavia when you can go to France, with its wealth, wine, women, and green summers? Now, these Vikings, they got so excited. They went on what we shall call a bit of a bender. They sailed all up and down the coasts and rivers of France, burning villages, stealing gold, and oh my goodness, killing people. What a shocker. Now, King Charles, he did not like what he saw. And what he didn't like especially was this one Viking dude named Rollo, who was presumably named after the candy. He destroyed so many towns, killed so many innocent civilians, quite frankly, it puts the US government to shame. But worst of all was that Rollo seized a bunch of land in northern France, along the coast, and he would not leave. Now, Charles, he thought about trying to kill Rollo, but he had a light bulb moment. Or I guess a lit candle. Anyway, he went to Rollo and he said, "Hey, Mr. Candyman, let's make a deal. I don't like you killing my people. That's a big no-no. So please, can you stop doing that? I will let you keep the lands you took from me as a fief, which you can rule over as my vassal. All you gotta do Love Jesus? Also protect me from your big scary cousins. Now, Rollo, he loved Mexican food. So worshipping a dude named Jesus was totally cool with him, and so he got baptized. And last Thanksgiving with his relatives, it was kind of rough, so he was totally fine not getting along with them. Now, the two men, they came to an agreement, but it wasn't official yet. How do you make an agreement official, you might wonder? Well, quite frankly, it's simple. You give away your young daughter to a middle-aged stranger who burns down towns for fun. And you know, that's what Charles, the best father ever, that's what he did. And so he gave away his baby girl named Gazella to Rollo. Or he probably didn't. You see, there are no contemporary records of Gazella, so she either got unpersoned by the shadow government or she didn't ever actually exist. Either way, Rollo was the ancestor of William the Conqueror, so if he didn't have children with Gazella, who did he end up with? Well, in medieval times, one could acquire a girlfriend through one simple trick, called human trafficking. Anyway, some of Rollo's Vikings, while doing some raiding, found a pretty French lady, whose name I don't know how to pronounce. Since I'm hungry, I'm going to call her Popeyes. Rollo made the chicken lady his concubine, and together they would have a son named William, who's not the William of our story, as we have about a century's worth of exposition left to go. Now this William, he had a son of his own, Richard the Fearless, and the two of them would go on to expand in the lands of their father and grandfather. They did this by stabbing their neighbors and by marrying their neighbors. Thankfully, things were a little bit more progressive, and the days of abducting women against their will were over. Instead, if you wanted a wife, you just walked up to a random French guy and handed him some money, and thus you could purchase his 14-year-old daughter. Now, unfortunately, Chris Hansen was busy eating pizza, and as such, these marriages went forward. The children born from these unions, being descended from Viking Northmen, would become known as the Normans. And since their leaders were descended from a candy, they put the two words together, and voila, the region of Normandy got its name. Now, the Normans didn't just limit marriage to the neighboring French. They would also go on to marry royalty across the Channel. You see, by the beginning of the first millennium, the Kingdom of England was under the rule of Ethelred the Unready. Ethelred was indeed unready, as early in his reign, Vikings showed up and caused a lot of problems for him. Now, all these Viking raids were bad enough, but they did bring attention to Ethelred the importance of Normandy across the Channel. You see, many Viking raiders, after visiting England, would go on and sail to their cousins in Normandy, where they used their ports as a place to crash, before returning home to Scandinavia. Ethelred had to do something to stop the Normans from aiding the Vikings. First, he tried to kidnap their Duke, Richard II. Unfortunately, Richard was diabetic and would not take free candy from strangers in vans, so that plan didn't pan out. If he couldn't get rid of them, maybe he could befriend the Normans. Ethelred was a widower, and Duke Richard of Normandy had an unwed sister named Emma. As you can guess, they got married and lived happily ever after. Except this isn't a Disney movie, and true happiness does not exist. So, Ethelred didn't have to worry about the Normans anymore, but he still had to deal with the Vikings. There were a bunch of Viking settlers on the coast of England, and these ones they had admittedly quit raiding. Instead, they settled down as farmers, living their lives as subjects of Ethelred, tending to the fields and taking antidepressants, because remember, they live in England. Anyway, Ethelred was scared these settlers might cause him trouble, so to ensure good relations, he befriended them and showed them love and understanding. Actually, he murdered a bunch of them. Now, no one could see this coming, but the Viking raiders, yeah, they didn't really like Ethelred killing their family members. So, in 1013, Sway and Forkbeard, very cool name by the by, decided to invade England. Now, he wasn't just a Viking. He was the actual king of both Denmark and Norway. Ethelred's armies, they could not beat the scary Vikings, and Ethelred was forced to abandon England and flee to his brother-in-law in Normandy. He would not have to remain in exile long, however, as in February of the next year, King Sweyn caught a bad case of mortality and had to be sent to the farm upstate. Now, England's nobles didn't really want to make Sweyn's son, Canute, their king. Maybe because they were racist, maybe because he didn't have any facial hair made of utensils like his father. I don't really know, and quite frankly, I don't care. What we do know is they called up Ethelred and offered him back the crown. So, he came back, pulled a Grover Cleveland, and once more sat upon the throne. This didn't last long, however, as Canute would return in 1016, and he would go on to conquer most of the country within a relatively short period of time. On the 23rd of April of that year, Ethelred's body, deciding that all this back and forth was a little bit too stressful, decided to take a permanent nap. His son, Edmund Ironside, attempted to hold out against the Danes, but he had his ass handed to him at the Battle of Assendun, and being done with it, he was forced into negotiations with Canute. They agreed to divide the country between them. Edward would remain king in the west, while Canute would reign in the east. I would more accurately describe this division of England were it not for the fact that Edmund, like his father and Sweyn before him, decided to also die. With a rule of but 221 days, the only thing he did was once again show the failings of the NHS. Now, Emma of Normandy had by now lost her position of queen twice, and had also lost both her husband and stepson. So, with nothing else to do, she got hitched to Canute and regained her title as queen. She was still a little afraid for the safety of her two sons, and thus she sent her boys, Alfred and Edward, to Normandy to live with her good old brother, Richard. The Duke, however, was busy enough as is with two sons of his own. The older was also named Richard, and the younger was named Robert the Magnificent. What a humble guy. Following Richard's death, his eldest succeeded as Richard III. Younger brother Robert, who presumably did not feel too magnificent on account of not being Duke, revolted against his brother. Now, Robert, he sucked at leading a revolt. Thus, he was captured and brought before his brother. Richard was both kind and idiotic, a very bad combination, and forgave his brother and released him, as long as he promised to be nice. In a turn of events easily foreseen by anyone who has an IQ higher than that of a toaster, Richard died rather mysteriously and suspiciously, and so Robert became the new Duke of Normandy. As if role-playing as Cain of biblical fame wasn't enough, he also took out his anger issues on his extended family. He went to war against both an uncle and cousin of his, forcing them to flee Normandy, which is bad enough on its own. But worse, since both of these relatives were also men who wore big fancy hats, aka bishops. He seized their church lands, confiscated their wealth, because why treat a house of God as such when you can use it as an expensive ATM? Now, one night, while out on the town, probably looking for other relatives to beat up, Robert happened to pass by a tanner's shop and caught a glimpse of said tanner's daughter. Robert brought said lady home, and following a non-YouTube friendly event and the passage of 9 months, our protagonist, William, was finally born. Despite not being born within lawful wedlock, Robert made William his heir. He also decided to reconcile with his uncle, reinstating him as the big hat man of Rouen. He also returned church property he had stolen. Why he did this, we don't know. Maybe he wanted to be a good role model for his son. Maybe he was scared of the inevitable flames of damnation. We can only speculate. To showcase his newfound love for the church, Robert would set out on a pilgrimage to the Holy Land. Now, dear viewer, if you're a Robert fan, I have both good news and some bad news. Good news, Robert succeeded in being closer to God. Bad news, it's because he died. Yes, Duke Robert became sick and died on the return journey, and as such, in the year 1035, the 8-year-old William became Duke of Normandy. Now, being an 8-year-old duke surrounded by power-hungry nobles is as dangerous as being a cat in Springfield, Ohio. Luckily, William had his father's uncle, the aforementioned Bishop Robert of Rouen, who protected William. Now, good Uncle Robert was a pretty chill dude, and he ruled his region on William's behalf, since William, being only 8, was busy playing Minecraft on the Xbox. Unfortunately, unlike in Minecraft, when Bishop Robert died in 1037, he could not respawn. As such, for the next 10 years, all the various nobles in Normandy would fight custody battles over William and for the power they could wield through him. There were numerous wars, and out of brevity and laziness, I will skip over them. Just know that the Duchy of Normandy was very unstable, and even when William came of age and needed no regent, there were still various rebellions he had to deal with, which, at the very least, did in fact shape him into a decent warrior and tactician. Now, while all this was going on, we're going to have to go on and perform a wellness check on England, because you see, King Canute's mailbox has been getting pretty full as of late, and all the neighbors are starting to get a little worried. And yep, I'm glad we checked in, because old Mr. Canute is in fact decomposing. Anyway, with Canute dead, the crown of England passed to his son Harold Harefoot, who based on his name was probably half Hobbit. Meanwhile, Canute's son with Emma, Harthcanute, would become king of Denmark. Now, Emma wasn't just content with being the wife of 2 kings of England. She also wanted to be the mother of one as well. So, she encouraged her son Harthcanute to challenge his father's will. Instead of hiring a lawyer and going to probate court, he decided to pay a little visit to his brother instead. Said visit consisted of 62 warships and a bunch of angry dudes armed with oversized toothpicks. Landing in Kent on the 17th of June, 1040, he didn't have to use any of those toothpicks. Why? Well, it's because his brother, Harold Hobbitfoot, decided to do what 3 of the previous 4 kings of England had done when faced with a challenger. He opted to forfeit the match and drop dead. Thus, Harthacnut became king without having to kill his brother, so I guess good on him. Now, Harthacnut, upon coming to power, did not have much in the way of challengers. No, his only enemy at the time was his mortality. Yes, he continued the time-honored tradition of 11th century English kings, that is, dying shortly after becoming monarch. Now, unlike his predecessors, he was kind enough to do so in a slow manner, giving him time to choose an heir. So, in 1041, he invited his half-brother, Edward, son of his mother Emma and of Ethelred, to come back to England and be said heir. On the 8th of June, 1042, Harthacnut died and went to the halls of Mandos. Thus, England found herself with a job opening for a CEO. Most members of the board were quick to support Edward, including Godwin, Earl of Wessex. This was admittedly a little bit awkward, because a few years back, he had blinded his brother, Alfred, Edward's brother that is, after introducing his eyeballs to the end of a red-hot poker. Edward and Godwin would, however, seemingly get along just fine, though, as Edward married Godwin's daughter Edith in 1045. Edward would also see to it that 5 of Godwin's sons would become earls of their own, including one named Harold Godwinson. Remember him, he will prove plot relevant in just a few moments. Now, King Edward the Confessor, as he would later become known, and Queen Edith didn't have any children. Now, not having a daughter is fine and all. After all, they are rather expensive. However, not having a son was a bit of a problem. No son to succeed him, Edward would have to choose his own heir. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to medieval Europe's favorite pastime show, Who Wants to be a King? On this evening's broadcast, we have King Edward of England, who has no sons of his own to inherit his crown. Thus, tonight, he must choose from among 3 contestants to determine who will be the next King of England. Contestant number 1, we have Edgar of the House of Wessex. He is a grandnephew of King Edward. Contestant number 2, we have Duke William of Normandy, who is a cousin of King Edward. And contestant number 3, we have Earl Harold Godwinson, a brother-in-law of King Edward. Now, while we were introducing the contestants, Edward has been behind stage making his own decision on who will be his successor. There he is. He's coming out. He's holding the envelope. He's about to let us know who he chose. And he is dead on the floor. Hands off, Norman. That is all, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us this evening. Please make sure to tune in next Saturday where we will cover the Wars of the Roses. In January of 1066, King Edward died. Harold, being at Edward's deathbed, alleged that Edward had promised him the throne. Thus, he was crowned king the very next day by the Anglo-Saxons. News of all this would reach William in Normandy, and to put it quite bluntly, he was greatly miffed. He was so miffed, in fact, he decided he would go on to conquer England. So, William assembled a large invasion fleet of 700 ships. This number is likely inflated, much like the US dollar. Most historians believe that the number of ships were greatly less. They were only, after all, carrying around 7,000 to 10,000 men. Now, these men were not all Normans. While most were, quite a few were mercenaries from Flanders and Brittany, which is a region in western France, not to be confused with the island of Britain, which William was about to curb stomp. Now, all the preparations for William's invasion were completed by August of 1066. He had his boats, he had his boys, and he also had stockpile Capri Suns in case anyone got thirsty on the boat ride. Now, William was not allowed to set sail at first, as the winds were not blowing in the right direction. A little-known fact, this was an actual act of God. Looking down from heaven, God himself saw William attempting to sail to England. In an act of divine mercy, he tried to keep William from making the colossal mistake. Unfortunately, William was set on the whole invading shtick, So God relented and allowed William to set sail. He would land in Pevensey in the county of Sussex in late September. King Harold was a little bit confused why anyone else would want his spongy, rain-soaked country. However, he himself had prepared. He had gathered an army and had waited in the south to meet William. However, while waiting for William, he would meet another challenger. Yes, for a final time, the Vikings make an appearance. It's time I introduce to you Harold Hardrada, a true Viking tryhard. You see, 20 years before 1066, the year 1046 if you're bad at math, Hardrada had inherited the kingship of Norway. Now, being king of Norway is alright, but neighboring Denmark? Who wouldn't want to be king of Denmark? Why, with its, what even is Denmark known for? Let's see, Wikipedia, it's got food, it's got Danes, it's got Legos. Legos are from Denmark. Yeah. So anyway, Hardrada obviously invaded Denmark in the hope of attaining an unlimited supply of Legos. Unfortunately, none of his campaigns worked out, which left him without Legos and without a second crown. Luckily, he saw all the chaos caused by Edward's death in England and decided to launch an invasion of his own. You see, Hardrada thought England was owed to him. Why? Well, remember King Harthacnut of England? Before he launched his own invasion of England in 1040, Harthacnut had promised to make a previous king of Norway, named Magnus, his heir, since he had no children himself. However, after becoming king, Harthacnut made a change of his plans and decided to allow his half-brother Edward to become the next king. Now, Magnus did not really like that, and had actually made plans to invade England, but he never got around to it, because apparently, while on one of his ships, he fell overboard and drowned. Other sources claim he died after falling off his horse. It is in fact known that he did at least die in Denmark, so my own personal theory is that he stepped on a Lego. Now, no matter how he died, Hardrada succeeded Magnus as king. In addition to inheriting said Kingdom of Norway, he also inherited Harthacnut's I owe you one England card, and he was intent to cash it in. So, at the same time as William and his Capri Sun drinking Normans made landfall in Pevensey in the south, Hardrada and his army landed in Tynemouth in the north. There he was joined by Harold's younger brother, Tostig, who did not much like his brother. So, Harold, of Godwinson fame, eager to defeat Hardrada and to beat up his brother, marched his men north. Now, it was a long distance between the Saxon army of Harold and the Viking army of Hardrada. To ensure his men got there fast, Harold led his army in prayer to Saint Sonicus of Segumonium. With the alleged help of the saint, Harold and his army were able to reach the Vikings in only 4 days, which was indeed very fast. The army of Hardrada and Tostig were caught by surprise, not expecting the Saxons to reach them as quick as they did. As a result, they were defeated by Harold at the Battle of Stamford Bridge on the 25th of September. Now, many interesting things occurred during this battle, but since this video is titled The Norman Invasion and not the Norwegian Screw-Up, we aren't going to talk about the battle. All you need to know is that Harold and the English won. Hardrada and Tostig were both killed, and a random Viking warrior was also killed after a spear was thrust into his gonads. Now, killing your rival for the throne, your brother, and some poor Viking's family lineage is something worth celebrating. Unfortunately, Harold was not able to celebrate because of that William dude in the south. So, once again, Harold was forced to fight another invading army. He marched south, and the two armies would meet near Hastings in Sussex on the 14th of October. Both sides consisted of around 10,000 men each, give or take. Harold positioned his forces on the top of a steep slope. Down below the Saxons, William moved his own men into position. He divided his troops into 3 groups. On the left flank were troops from Brittany, led by Alan Rufus, who was hoping that no matter who would win, both sides would have fun. The right flank consisted of frog eaters, a derogatory yet accurate term for French people. They were led by Fitz Osbern, a cousin of Duke William and Count Eustace of Boulogne. William's center was led by the Duke himself. The battle would begin when Norman archers began firing arrows uphill at the Saxons. This proved ineffective because the English made use of a little-known circular item to protect themselves. Seeing that a new tactic was indeed needed, William sent forth his spearmen, who once again failed to make an opening in the Saxon line. As a result, Norman cavalry also joined the melee, but they quickly realized dying in battle is very uncashed money, and so they fled back down the hill, with many Anglo-Saxons giving up the high ground in favor of chasing them. If that wasn't bad enough for the Normans, it turns out that William himself had actually been killed in the fighting. This was a shock to everyone, none more so than William, who was actually not dead. William then rallied his men and charged back up the hill. Now, the Saxons, who had broken formation in order to pursue the previously fleeing Normans, found themselves cut down by the Normans. King Harold, and those among his army who had shown better restraint and remained upon the hill, realized that they were up the creek without a paddle, yet they bravely fought on. Eventually, though, Harold was killed after a Norman arrow struck him in the eye. Oh, damn. Harold's death effectively ended the battle, as all surviving Saxons quickly took to their heels and ran. Following his victory at Hastings, William marched north, expecting that England's nobles would accept him as their king. They did not, however, and elected a different man as king. Remember Edward the Confessor's grandnephew Edgar? He was that king. This infuriated William, who scared the Saxons so bad that Edgar would actually surrender. On Christmas Day, 1066, William was crowned as King of England at Westminster Abbey. While his first few years as king would see minor rebellions against his rule, William would consolidate his grip. He would grant lands and titles to his Norman supporters, and by the time of his death in 1087, England would be firmly under his administration and that of his Norman successors. His descendants would inherit his desire for expansion and conquest, and would go on to conquer sheepland, skirtland, and even alcohol land. And with the discovery of the New World and colonization, the British Empire was born. This empire that conquered a quarter of the world would not have existed if William had failed in 1066. His invasion changed the course of history, and is therefore surely worthy of remembrance throughout the ages to come. What, you're expecting a proper outro? I'm too lazy to make one of those, so this video is just going to end in 7 seconds.